My husband, Richard, got really angry when he found out I couldn't inherit my father's estate. He yelled at me, saying, "You can't inherit the property. I don't need you anymore. We're getting divorced now." Later, I got my revenge on my husband and sister who had remarried. My name is Linda. I'm 32 and work in an office. I married Richard 2 years ago after a relative introduced us. My family had some wealth, and since my sister Susan and I were the only children, our relatives were worried about who would inherit. They thought it was important for me to marry Richard. Richard moved in with us at my family home. After my mother passed away, it was just my father, Richard, and me living together. Richard seemed nice and treated my father well, but a relative had warned me that Richard was obsessed with money. I was worried by this warning but didn't see any signs of greed, so we went ahead with the marriage. Even after we were married, I kept an eye on Richard because of the warning. He didn't seem greedy, but he did ask about my father's wealth and how much property we had. My father talked about it openly, so I wasn't too concerned. Richard also showed interest in my sister Susan. She's 5 years younger than me, lively and outgoing, while I'm calm and reserved. Susan's relationships with men are quite flashy, and Richard was surprised by how different she was from me. Seeing Richard fascinated by my beautiful sister made me feel uneasy. Our relatives had introduced me, a quiet and plain person, because they were worried about who would inherit the family home if I didn't marry. I thought Susan's beauty would be enough to make things okay, but I later understood why her relatives were worried. My father spoiled Susan, letting her go to college and even to community college afterward. Susan didn't have any specific goals, she just didn't want to work. My mother tried to persuade my sister to get a job right after college, but my father insisted on letting her go to community college. After graduating from community college, Susan got a job at one of my father's acquaintances' companies but quit after just 6 months. She said the job didn't let her show her talents, which surprised my mother and me since she hadn't been there long. Despite her short time at the job, my father believed Susan and quickly found her another job. When Susan started working at this new place, my mother fell ill and was hospitalized. Susan visited the hospital every day but mostly just sat with my mother or stared at her phone. She eventually quit this job too, claiming she needed to take care of my mother, but her care was minimal. I had to handle changing my mother's laundry and other tasks. About a month after being hospitalized, my mother's condition worsened and she could no longer speak. Within 2 weeks, she passed away. My father and Susan were so overwhelmed by the news that they couldn't help with the funeral preparations, so I had to take care of everything. Thankfully, with help from our relatives, we were able to give my mother a peaceful farewell. After our mother's death, Susan started a part-time job and moved out on her own. Her part-time salary wasn't enough to cover her rent, so my father started paying for it and her utilities. Susan uses her earnings for fun and goes to my father for extra money whenever she runs short. When our mother was alive, she was strict with Susan, so my father didn't give her any allowance. Now he gives her as much money as she wants. I thought it was okay if both my father and sister were happy with their arrangement. Even after I got married and moved in with my husband at my parents' home, my father kept giving Susan an allowance. I didn't realize it at the time, but Susan was also asking my husband for money, and he was happily giving it to her. He couldn't refuse her because she was so charming. He even asked Susan to keep it secret from me, saying that if I found out, I might get jealous. Susan seemed to be living off the money from my father and husband, working at her part-time job only when she felt like it. But this lifestyle didn't last. When my father fell ill and had to be hospitalized, I was visiting him between work. Susan, however, never showed up. Instead, she started calling me, demanding more money. She said, "I've been getting money from Dad every month, so keep giving it to me. The rent and utilities are all being paid from Dad's account." She spoke to me angrily, which was shocking because I hadn't realized how much money she was getting. I was really angry at Susan for only caring about herself and not about our sick father. I wanted to hang up on her, but she seemed to be in trouble, so I asked her how much money our father had been giving her every month. I asked my sister how much money she was getting from our father every month. She told me grumpily that she received $1,000 a month and rent was separate. I was stunned that she was so proud of this amount. I realized that if I kept giving her this much money every month, she might never feel motivated to work seriously. I didn't think it was a big issue as I expected my father to recover soon after his hospitalization. But then my father's condition suddenly worsened. I quickly contacted our relatives, and the doctor warned us that it was a serious situation. I wanted my husband's support during this difficult time, but he rarely visited the hospital, claiming he was busy with work. When he did come, he would ask inappropriate questions like, Joseph's inheritance must be huge, right? Since you and your sister are the only heirs, are you going to split it in half? I was shocked and disgusted by his focus on inheritance rather than supporting me. When I called Susan to inform her about our father's critical condition, she only cared about her money. She demanded, "Make sure you pay me every month. I can't live without that money." The call with my sister ended abruptly. I was furious at her words, but I was also unsettled by the faint male voice I heard on the other end of the phone. It gave me a bad feeling. About a month later, my father passed away, and neither my sister nor my husband were there for his final moments. From my experience with my mother's funeral, I knew how hard it was to prepare everything. My husband and sister didn't help with anything, and my sister didn't even attend the funeral. My husband showed up briefly but left quickly, saying he had work. A relative who had introduced me to my husband noticed his absence and asked me where Richard was. I had to explain that he was busy with work and went home. The relative seemed to accept this explanation, but I was frustrated. After the funeral, when I finally had a moment to relax, my husband asked me with a sleazy grin how much I inherited. He seemed obsessed with the inheritance. I hadn't even talked to the lawyer yet and was still dealing with the funeral arrangements. My husband was excited when he learned that I inherited nothing and my sister about $92 million. He yelled at me, "You can't inherit any property. I don't need you anymore. Let's divorce now." I was equally determined and replied, "Let's do it. You married me for my father's inheritance in the first place. I'll divorce you." I handed him the prepared divorce papers. He seemed a bit surprised but signed them. As he left, he said, "I'll divorce you, who gets nothing, and marry your sister Susan, who gets the $92 million. Then he walked away. I didn't care about my ex-husband's words and went ahead with the divorce. I was glad to be rid of him. It seemed he immediately began planning to marry my sister the next day. A few days later, my ex-husband called me, demanding to know when I would handle the inheritance and give Susan the $92 million. I had been waiting for him to contact me and didn't want to reach out first. I responded calmly, saying, "Let's discuss this at my place next Sunday. I'm preparing for the procedure and will be waiting." Thinking he would soon get the inheritance, my ex-husband hung up happily. I was looking forward to seeing his reaction when he learned the truth. On the weekend, my ex-husband and sister came to my family home. They were surprised to find a lawyer there. My ex-husband, thinking it was normal to have a lawyer for a large inheritance, wasn't too worried. The lawyer then turned to my ex-husband with a puzzled look and said, "Before we discuss the inheritance, we need to address Linda's compensation claim against Richard." The lawyer showed my ex-husband several photos of him leaving my sister's house with clear dates marked. These photos were evidence of his infidelity before the divorce was finalized. I had heard my ex-husband talking about the inheritance on the phone with my sister and asked the lawyer to investigate his infidelity. My ex-husband and sister met almost daily, giving me plenty of evidence. The discussion quickly shifted from inheritance to compensation, leaving my ex-husband and sister stunned. But my ex-husband soon regained his composure and said, "Compensation is nothing compared to the $92 million inheritance. I'll pay it right away." He signed the compensation claim documents handed to him by the lawyer, acting all high and mighty. I confirmed the documents and told him, "Enjoy your life with my sister, who inherited nothing." When my ex-husband and sister heard that the inheritance was zero, my sister screamed in disbelief, "Why isn't there any inheritance for me?" My ex-husband turned red with anger and said, "There's no way the inheritance is zero. I won't let you take it all." The lawyer calmly explained, "Susan is the stepdaughter of your late mother, but since she wasn't legally adopted by your late father, there is no legal parent-child relationship. Therefore, Susan cannot inherit your father's estate." I added, "When our parents were married, Susan was only about a year old, so she might not remember, but I was 6 and remember being happy to have a new sister. I never thought she would steal my husband." My parents had young children when they remarried, and they had a mediator who thought it was best for them to marry. My mother loved me as her own, and my father spoiled Susan, possibly because she wasn't his biological daughter and he wanted to be extra careful of her. Even though my parents remarried with children, my mother suspected that some relatives were interested in our family's wealth, so she never legally adopted Susan. The relatives only recommended marriage proposals to me because they knew I was the only one who could inherit my father's property. If my parents had a child together, things might have been even more complicated. Fortunately or unfortunately, they never had another child. Now I understand why my father continued to support Susan financially even after she became an adult. He couldn't pass on his inheritance to her. I also never legally adopted my mother, so we weren't legally parent and child. but that never mattered in our daily lives. It seems my parents never told Susan about this, so she only learned the truth now. Today, my ex-husband and sister realized the truth. Not only did they fail to get the inheritance they expected, but my ex-husband had also signed documents agreeing to pay compensation. His face went from bright red to pale blue as he learned the inheritance was a lie, created to get back at him for cheating. My ex-husband asked if it was true that my sister was getting nothing and I was getting the $92 million. I told him it was a lie designed to punish him and that my father's estate wasn't worth that much. Even my wealthy father didn't have $92 million. My sister, who had been silent, panicked. She had spent a lot of money expecting an inheritance and asked if I would cover it. I told her to rely on her new husband, Richard. My ex-husband, now at his limit due to the compensation payments, apologized deeply, asking for forgiveness and a fresh start. It was a dramatic change from his previous arrogance. After their departure, my ex-husband and sister soon divorced. My ex-husband, having married my sister for her inheritance, showed no interest in her once it was clear there was none. With no assets of his own, he was required to pay compensation in installments from his salary. My sister struggled with debt and ended up filing for personal bankruptcy. She eventually disappeared, and no one knows where she went. Without the financial support from my father, my sister couldn't manage her debt. I continued living alone in my family home. Though some relatives suggested potential suitors, I chose to search for a partner on my own, determined to avoid another man like my ex-husband.